After more than 35 relentless years of carnage, the Second Succession War finally ran out of steam in 2863, grinding to a shuddering halt along all fronts. Just as was the case with its predecessor before, this did not happen because of any strong desire for peace, but simply because the great houses could no longer muster enough strength to wage war on one another. As soon as the firing stopped, aid and recovery teams were dispatched to the frontier worlds who had again been scarred by the depredations of war. For many, it was already too late. Though fewer planets had been subjected to orbital bombardments or mass WMD use, for those colonies that were hanging on by a thread after the first conflict, the commencement of the Second Succession War so soon after ruined any slim chance of survival. Since 2830, another 218 systems were abandoned or had their populations completely eradicated, and only 2 new colonies had been founded by people fleeing to the Periphery. Just as had happened before, the worlds lying outside the Inner Sphere were not spared the horrors of the Succession Wars, despite taking no part in the fighting, as almost half of those abandoned planets had been part of the Periphery. Most sources shy away from giving an estimate for the total number of casualties sustained during the Second Succession War, due to the complications with determining which of the 2 post-Starleague conflicts are to blame for the countless people who died of starvation or disease. What little consensus there is tends to settle on a loose hundreds of millions dead, though how high that goes is anyone's guess. The number of people wounded or displaced is surely in the billions. However obscene the death toll might have been, it was insignificant compared to the First Succession War, and so those in power were able to disregard it with worrying ease. They were more interested in seeing what several generations of bloody conquest had won them. It's difficult to imagine that any were excited by the reports that soon crossed their desks. Even those who had managed to take and hold foreign lands had to face the reality that many planets had been rendered worthless by the fighting. Coupled with the interior worlds now abandoned and the loss of advanced technology they had all suffered, they found precious little to celebrate. Rather than touting any great victories to their people, the Successor Lords simply claimed that vanquishing their enemies was justification enough for so many lives spent, and would likely be the cause for resuming the conflict in the future. For as little as the balance in power between the great houses shifted during the early Succession Wars, the Inner Sphere had nonetheless undergone some significant changes in its borders in the 100 years since the Starleague Civil War began. For starters, several states no longer existed. The Terran hegemony had at one time been a star empire of 124 systems, not counting the many shared worlds or periphery outposts. The last vestige of that government, ComStar, held only Terra. The Rimworld's Republic had colonized 244 systems, but lost 86 to Steiner's Operation Ulmerich, a defeat which ultimately brought down the government. Of the Forsaken Worlds, only 68 had managed to eke out a living, including the reborn Oberon Confederation. The rest had either evacuated or starved. The other Periphery realms had not been encroached upon by the Inner Sphere, but had nonetheless been forced to abandon several of their colonies. The Magistracy of Canopus and Taurian Concordat had lost 13 each, while the Outworlds Alliance had lost 62. They may have settled one new world, but 8 others had broken away to form their own microstate. Unfortunately, going it alone proved too great a challenge for Trader's Domain, and the fragile alliance would dissolve towards the end of the century. Of the successor states themselves, if any can be considered winners of the last 100 years of conflict, the most likely candidate is the Draconis Combine. They were the only realm to have expanded in both directions, establishing large salients into both of their rivals by the end of the Second Succession War. Reviewing the individual military districts, Benjamin and Razelhaig had both done well, losing almost nothing while making significant gains. Dieron had initially grown dramatically as it absorbed large chunks of the Terran hegemony, but more recently had been losing ground to all 3 of its neighbours. Gallatin had seen some changes, but a balance was more or less maintained, whereas the only shift in Pesht had been those systems abandoned over the course of the war. Going from the strongest to the weakest, the Capellan Confederation was unquestionably the biggest loser so far. It had been steadily squeezed by both of its neighbours, and had almost no major successes on the battlefield. Tikhonov may have expanded coreward into the old Terran hegemony, but the free worlds had pressed inwards, and any gains against the Federated Suns reversed. Sarna reclaimed part of Kenyan Marik salient, but Davion had taken a large chunk out of the spinward side of the region, as they had for the Capella, Cyan and St. Ives commonalities too. The Free Worlds border had been very dynamic during the Second Succession War, but by the end of the conflict, the situation had more or less reset. Worst affected was Andurian, a region of space that Liao had seemingly only managed to retain control of thanks to the Star League Accords. It and the small Chesterton commonality would soon disappear altogether. The Lyran Commonwealth had mixed fortunes in the early succession wars. Before they had begun, Steiner had taken more territory during Operation Ulmerich than any other realm had managed since. Similar gains were made from the collapsing Terran hegemony. The first war had seen the Bolan Thumb more or less reclaimed, and the job was finished in the second. They had steadily given ground to the Kuritans, but had still achieved some victories on that front. The Federation of Sky had proven itself a formidable bastion in the face of aggression from both major enemies, and even the Federated Suns. They were the only province to beat back the Draconis Combine. The Tamar Pact, by contrast, had suffered greatly, and their capital was now perilously close to the border. A Kuritan salient had forced them to cede control of the rimward tip of their province to House Lestrade. The Protectorate of Donegal, safely removed from the most dangerous foe, could boast about their strong performances, having gained far more along the rimward flank than they had lost. In 2837, the Free Worlds League had undergone a hard reset to their Succession War progress when the Captain General recalled all his forces from foreign territory in the wake of ComStar's communications interdiction. The hurt kept coming for them over the next 5 years, but they managed nonetheless to make a remarkable recovery by winning back most of those systems in the last 2 decades. The minor provinces in the Terran region had not fared so well. Both the Duchy of Kalidasa and Border Protectorate had been overrun in the First and Second Wars, respectively. The Syrian Concordance had also lost its capital. The Marik Commonwealth had unexpectedly found itself on the front lines at one point, but managed to pull through. The Rim and Stuart commonalities had weathered the storm, as had the other minor provinces, Abbey District, Duchies of Graham, Marik and Tamarind, Principality of Gibson, and Regulum Free States. The Principality of Regulus may have avoided any actual conflict, but not so political fights, which saw it lose ground to its coreward rival. The Grand Duchy of Oriente, who had shifted from the control of one noble house to another, and their vassal Duchy of Orlov, had managed to hold the line in the face of determined Liao assaults, but otherwise had achieved little. This was not so for the Duchy of Andurian, who despite losing several systems to independence movements, had undergone greater expansion than any other province of the Free Worlds League. The Federated Suns had an extremely tough time of things in the First Succession War, but against all odds had managed to recover most of its territory by war's end. Looking only at the second though, it's a completely different story. They had the best performance of any great house in terms of systems taken. The Draconis March, now based out of the old capital at Tancredi IV, had been one of the most dynamic fronts of the war. In the Woodbine operational area, they had achieved some limited success, pushing up along the Outworlds Alliance border. At the other end, in the new Exeter operational area, they had managed to re-establish a vital Terran corridor. Their most notable loss came at Robinson, where the Kuritans sowed devastation using their full range of WMDs. The planet was still under occupation, and Davion was already working on plans to recover it. The Crucis March underwent no significant changes, save for the near disaster back in 2796. Paul Davion's reformation would hopefully ensure such a situation would never occur again. But the greatest change had come along the Capellan March border. Both the Cathal and Eucertis operational areas had proven almost unstoppable as they expanded into Liao territory. These victories were tinged with an element of defeat. That region of space had been particularly scarred during the Second Succession War. As the enemy withdrew, they conducted a scorched earth policy, dooming any chances of survival for those left behind. While the common citizens held out hope that the fragile peace would last, and the nobility and politicians wished for time to incorporate their new territory into the realm, for the military leaders of the Inner Sphere who could not see beyond their next battle, all they cared about was the condition of their forces and how soon they might be able to launch the next attack, or might expect one coming their way. Even a cursory glance at the 2864 figures makes it clear just how abysmal the situation had become. Understanding the sorry state of affairs on the front line leaves no questions as to why the Successor Lords had been forced to seek a peace, regardless of their own personal leanings. Not since before the Age of War, when they were still proto-states huddling around the Terran hegemony, did the various armed forces of the Inner Sphere have such little available manpower and materiel. Furthermore, the warships that once threatened devastation on any world were now completely extinct. Throughout this series, we have highlighted whenever a battlemech regiment was destroyed in combat, but significant gaps in our knowledge paint a false picture. While we can be relatively accurate in pinpointing the moment at which the majority of Liao and Marik losses happened, the date of destruction for half of Davion's and 3/4 of Kurita and Steiner's mech casualties are unknown. Removing those from our map based on recorded 2864 deployments gives us our first accurate snapshot of the Inner Sphere militaries since the start of the war. There is a common misbelief that the 31st century militaries are weaker than at any prior point in the history of the successor states. While it is true that technological sophistication has continued to decline over the past century and a half, the great houses have actually been gradually rebuilding their strength in the years since their true nadir at the conclusion of the Second Succession War. Beginning with the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery, who at one time had been the preeminent power among the successor states, they had dropped from a high of equivalent strength to over 147 battlemech regiments, to under 119 by the time the Second War began, and continued to plummet down to less than 36. On paper, they had 92 regiments, but those had an average readiness level of just 40%. Some have described the Liao realm as the sick man of the Inner Sphere. If there was a point at which they ceased to be on par with the other great houses, it was the Second Succession War. Back in 2786, the humble Capellan Confederation armed forces could field a respectable 118 mech regiments. The rebuilding effort after the First Succession War had brought them back to almost 92. By 2864, if they were to condense what materiel they had left, they could barely scrape together 21 units. On paper, they could still call on 51 regiments with an average strength of 42%, but with such a paltry offering available, their reduction in territory was perhaps a blessing in disguise when it came to defense. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces began the First War with 120 factory-fresh battlemech regiments, and had recovered to more or less that same number, albeit in a much sorrier state of repair. The Second Succession War had highlighted their poor condition, and they could now call on just 35 regiments worth of mechs. A 44% average strength put their 78 listed units slightly above the Inner Sphere norm. The Freewells League military had begun with ever so slightly less, around 119 regiments worth. They began the second conflict with just over 93, but now they too couldn't even field 35 if they were to consolidate what mechs remained to them. With a readiness rating of almost 49%, the 72 battlemech regiments were in a fantastic shape for the era. All of them were no doubt raring to go. Perhaps that's what some of the most delusional among their command structure were saying. The armed forces of the Federated Sons was the only realm to get close to the Combine in 2786, but they had taken a far greater beating in that first war, dropping from a high of 140 mech regiments in strength to just over 100 by the time the second began. Better successes in that later conflict meant that they had closed the gap to their rivals. All of their battle mechs combined now amassed to just under 35 units. Their roles still optimistically listed 81 regiments, plus one additional battalion, which together had a combat effectiveness of roughly 43%. For the sake of completeness, we'll mention now that the Periphery militaries had declined just as their Innisphere counterparts had. There was no realistic chance of them ever recovering to their Reunification War era figures or challenging the Great Houses. The technological and societal decay was as complete there as everywhere else. Mercenaries had seen their importance grow over the 80 years since Kerensky's departure. Though they had been as much victims of the war as everyone else had, their casualties were offset by an ever-increasing number of them. In 2786, they had accounted for less than 6% of the battlemech numbers across human space. By 2864, that figure had risen to over 15% and has continued to increase in the modern era. And that's only counting those units large enough to field at least a battalion. There are an uncountable number of smaller mercenary bands that field a company or less that don't make it into our figures. In contrast to the First Succession War, few formal peace agreements were reached by the warring parties. Only the humiliating concessions made by Danemar Liao and a limited restriction between Marik and Steiner that they would not target the other family's members held back the tide. Naturally, there was a desire by many to foster a stronger state of harmony, and that charge was led by the young Archon Elizabeth Steiner. Among her immediate neighbours, she found a like-minded individual in Philippa Marik, but Michael Davion was also amenable to talks. On November 9, 2864, an army of diplomats and civil servants from across the Innisphere converged on New Earth, hoping to formally agree an end to the succession wars. The peace talks could not have gotten off to a more inauspicious start. The Draconis Combine ambassador loudly declared that they had no intention of agreeing to a peace, nor did they even have the authority to discuss terms. They were simply there to observe proceedings. James Marik, the Freewells League ambassador, did not share his mother's temperament, losing Steiner the support she was sorely counting on. First Prince Michael Davion had tasked the Federated Sons ambassador, Luther Davion, with getting the others to agree to name him First Lord of the Star League. Such demands had sparked the succession wars in the first place, and were counter to everything Steiner was trying to achieve at New Earth. Lastly, the Capellan ambassador would not accept peace until all worlds taken by their neighbour states were returned to the Confederation, an impossible request. After 7 weeks of stalled talks, the participants threw up their hands in defeat. Each would return to their realm with news that no peace could be agreed, thus ensuring that a third succession war was all but inevitable. The Kuritan delegate would not even make it that far. He was arrested by the Lyran Intelligence Corps and executed as a spy. There was, of course, one other major faction involved in the Second Succession War, the one who had instigated the entire conflict in the first place, ComStar. Despite some missteps along the way, for them it had been a tremendous success. Jerome Blake's death set the ball in motion, and his successor Konrad Toyama had worked tirelessly to see his plans unfold on the grand stage. The Order had undergone a dramatic transformation following Raymond Karpov's takeover, to the point where it is almost unrecognizable to the ComStar of Blake's day. The debate continues as to how much of the fanaticism that became a hallmark of the ComStar Order was intended by Jerome when he first concocted the idea. What little we know suggests he only intended to use religion as a means to ensure his organization's survival. Operation Holy Shroud seems to conflict with his stated desires. Regardless, it is beyond question that ComStar's strength grew considerably over the course of the war. For them, the slaughter unleashed by the Great Houses had brought them one step closer to achieving their destiny. Their influence over the successor states had grown substantially, to the point where they were almost unchallengeable, and this trend seemed sure to continue. It could be argued that Raymond Karpov was the single most powerful person in existence at that point, puppet master to the petty successor lords, a man who could bend them to his own will. With him at the reins, Blessed Blake's vision of ComStar leading humanity into a new golden age would surely come true. And so concludes our history of the Second Succession War. This one has been an absolute blast to put together, and it has taken shape far quicker than any other I've done in the past. In fact, I think I'm going to say that this is my favourite conflict in the timeline so far. I think part of the reason I enjoyed it so much is that every nation had at least one major political upheaval or scandal, and that gave me just so much more to discuss than simply listing off battle after battle after battle. I'm not sure yet, but I think there's a good chance that this will end up being the last of the 4-hour plus projects I do. Looking forwards, the Third Succession War, we don't have nearly as much information about the early years as we do in the last century of history we've covered, and so I think it's just naturally going to be a much shorter period of time to cover. And yes, we do get a lot more info as we get into the 31st century, and I especially want to give good focus to Anton's revolt. But overall, I expect the third to be much shorter, the fourth to be shorter still, and then after that you've got several minor conflicts which can be just covered in probably 1 hour-long episode. And then even once we get to the clan invasion era, yes, that is a long period of time, that is a lot of novels and sourcebooks to cover. But actually, it's a series of smaller conflicts at the beginning, middle, and end. That's getting way ahead of ourselves though. I've said this at several points throughout this series, but I'm really glad I made the decision to change the music I was using for the Second Succession War. I'm not at all displeased with how I've used the BattleTech soundtracks in the past, and I think they really suited the somber tone I was going for back then, and that could have easily carried on to the Second Succession War where ComStar is manipulating things behind the scenes and creating a conflict where there needn't have been. But by using those tracks by Solar Fields, it gives it an almost joyously villainous quality, which I think has made this a lot more enjoyable. I want to give a big thank you to the Gaming Ambience channel, who very graciously let me use his extended mixes of those tracks. That ended up removing what used to be a huge headache as I tried to fit the different songs to specific parts of the video. I also want to thank you guys for your continued support. You may have noticed that this series came out far quicker than any prior one I've done. Usually I have a period right in the middle where I just completely burn out and go radio silent for a month or two, but not so this time around, and that's largely because of your encouragement right the way through. I did make some changes to try and make the process a little bit more streamlined. I already mentioned the music, but also removing the complication of having to animate the individual regimental icons moving around the map. Just having them jump to the next location probably saved me about a dozen hours in editing over the course of this series. If you have any feedback for me at all, I'd be thrilled to hear it. I'm always looking to improve. I always feel like I'm iterating on what I've done before. To be honest, I actually struggle to watch my earlier content, even stuff as recent as the Star League Civil War. I look at it and all I can see are the errors and imperfections, and frankly I think the production quality is quite a bit below where I'm at now. I think one of the biggest changes for the better is just in my vocal delivery, which I still think is terrible, but is a hell of a lot better than me whispering into the mic in those early series or talking at 500 miles an hour. Hopefully that will continue to improve going forwards. So naturally, folks are going to ask what I'm doing next. Well, I have a couple different ideas. Obviously, the Third Succession War is next in the timeline, and I will be moving into that. I have mentioned in the past just doing a 1-hour video to take us up to the 31st century. Once I actually start writing, I might see that that's either a good idea or a bad one, and I might break it down into smaller chunks if that seems better. But while I'm working on the Third Succession War series, I'm also going to be doing a couple of side projects within the BattleTech universe. So one thing I've talked about in the past is doing some small videos on the history of new minor periphery nations that arise before 3025. So probably first will be the Oregon Reach, covering their history from the Foundation immediately after the Second Succession War ends, up to 3022 when the HBS BattleTech game takes place. I have one other big idea that's probably going to come a little bit later in the year, but I'm waiting for the BattleTech Universe sourcebook to come out in the summer I think it's planned to release. I want to check that book for any new details before I record it. Besides BattleTech though, I would like to expand my Lore and History series into a different franchise. Now I've mentioned this a few times on my Patreon page. The reason I want to diversify a little bit is because in the past, while I've had that drive to work on things, the videos have come together very quickly, and all has been well, but eventually I just hit that point of burnout, and I don't want to look at it anymore for like a month or two. Having a little bit more variety on my end in terms of the kind of thing I'm working on would delay that burnout, but also if it comes in, it might be just limited to one particular franchise, which means I can expand and do things on a different one, and therefore continue a regular upload pace on the channel. I think that about covers everything I want to talk about. God, this outro has been going on for 10 plus minutes by this point, so I'll wrap it up now. Thank you very much for watching and for all your support over the last few months and going back years for some of you. If you want updates on how the Third Succession War series and those side projects I mentioned are going, you can check out my Patreon page. You don't need to be a patron to be able to read the progress updates. But if you do want to support me there, you can get early access to the videos. I upload them as soon as I've completed them. So one more time guys, thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed the Second Succession War series, and fingers crossed I'll see you again soon on another video.